Welcome everyone to the latest Diplomat webinar. I'm Shannon Tiezi, the editor-in-chief at the Diplomat magazine, and today we are going to be talking about de-risking. De-risking is the hot new topic in economic security discussions. It even made it into the G7 Hiroshima leaders' communique. That document defined the group's approach to economic security as de-risking, not decoupling, which means diversifying and deepening partnerships rather than severing old ones. At the heart of this discussion, of course, is China, and a growing sense of concern about Beijing's ability and demonstrated willingness to use its economic clout as a weapon, whether that means cutting off access to crucial materials or shutting its markets to other countries that have displeased China's leaders. De-risking is still an emerging concept and approaches can differ from government to government. So today we are pleased to have experts on economic security from three of China's East Asian neighbors, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, who are going to help us dissect what de-risking means for their countries, all of which have deep economic ties to China. We are joined today by Christina Lai, who is an associate research fellow in the Institute of Political Science at Academica Sinica in Taiwan, as well as an adjunct faculty in global security studies at Johns Hopkins University. We're also joined by Kazuto Suzuki, who is a professor of science and technology policy at the Graduate School of Public Policy at the University of Tokyo, Japan. And rounding out our expert panel is Wonho, a research fellow and head of the economic security team at the Korea Institute for International Economic Policy. So first, a huge thank you to our three panelists for joining us. So I'm going to ask each of our panelists to provide introductory remarks, just talking briefly about perspectives on de-risking in your respective countries. How big a concern is economic reliance on China, and what steps are being taken to address this issue? So Christina, we will start with you for the perspective from Taiwan.
Yeah, so good morning, everyone. It's my pleasure to share my words on Taiwan's strategy in countering China's coercion and the prospect of de-risking with the members and fellows in the Diplomat magazine. So my talk today will first highlight how Taiwan responds to China's economic measures, and will highlight the agency of medium-sized country in the shadow of great powers. So Taiwan is at the forefront of China's economic and military coercion, as Beijing will not renounce the use of force to deter Taiwan's independent movement. But private business sectors in Taiwan, who are heavily dependent on bilateral trades, have a strong interest in maintaining stable China-Taiwan relations. Therefore, I think China's overall economic strategy toward Taiwan best exemplifies the analogy of carrot and sticks. And Beijing's use of economic coercion and selective incentive will help further shape Taiwan's policy option toward China in the future. So when Tsai Ing-wen was elected president in 2016, Beijing has imposed limits on the numbers of Chinese tourists allowed to travel to Taiwan. And the economic loss suffered from Taiwan tourist industry has led to street protests and urging President Tsai to mend relations with China. And the Tsai administration adopted a diversification strategy by attracting visitors from Southeast Asian countries and encouraging domestic travel to support local business. So although such a policy measure could not completely offset the loss from Chinese tourist ban, I think Taiwan tourism industry has gradually lessened its dependence on China's tourists and expand its clientele to become more diverse. So I think the Taiwanese government was kind of able to execute a structural adjustment for the Taiwan's tourist industry that was previously heavily dependent on Chinese tourism. For example, in 2018, the Tourism Bureau had offered travel subsidy to boost domestic tourism. And most of the tourist site or natural wonders were both included and applied to both independents and group travelers. And Taiwan's diversification strategy will attempt to lessen the loss to the Chinese tourism by replacing them with a visitor from Southeast Asian country. And it promotes Taiwan's tourism to Muslim visitors. And Taiwan has always been a culturally diverse place. the Taiwanese government will lower the visa requirement for Southeast Asian country and promote greater exchange program in education and culture and tourism. So even though it cannot really fully recover from the economic damage brought by the loss of Chinese tourism, but I think the number of visitors from other, Asian country has steadily increased since then. And beyond tourism, I think Taiwan new southbound policy also help increase economic tie and diversify Taiwan's economic relations to Southeast Asian country that have helped to lessen the negative impacts of China economic coercion and kind of spur innovation in Taiwan's economy. Specifically, I think the Taiwanese government has offered special loan to Taiwan's company wanted to conduct business with Southeast Asian country or New Zealand, Australia, or India. And at the same time, Taiwan has also implemented several initiatives, including the innovative industrial plan to create new profit for some key sector. I think there are like 5 flagship programs, including innovative industry and biomedical industry and policy forum and for youth exchange and agriculture and talent cultivation program to showcase Taiwan's soft power appeal. I'll just give a specific example. The Taiwan's cultivation of industrial talent plan will help India to advance its technology in semiconductor and smartphone design. So Taiwan's initiative in incubating the industrial talents will certainly carry great potential to reach out to other countries in the Southeast Asia. And secondly, I think Taiwan's securitization strategy will be highly relevant in when we're talking about de-risking with China economy. The Taiwan securitization strategy can be traced back to the debate, way back to 2010, the Economic Cooperation Framework Agreement, so-called ECFA, that thought to strengthen ties with China. So at that time, Taiwan adopted a pragmatic approach in trying to highlight the long-term effect of deepening economic integration with China. In particular, her public statement was raising awareness among the Taiwanese public as to the cost of possibly undermining Taiwan's sovereignty in exchange of this ECFA agreement. Specifically, Tsai has stressed that Taiwanese people need to understand the negative impacts of economic dependence on China, as they would, make Taiwan more vulnerable, but also undermine Taiwan's democratic government. So when President Tsai and the DPP won the 2016 election, the Taiwanese government has actively addressed China's economic and security threat to Taiwan's most cherished and democratic liberal value. And the Tsai administration has gained legitimacy through securitizing China-Taiwan trade. And President Tsai was able to convince the general public that over-reliance on China's economy could be detrimental to Taiwan's democratic system. So the policy measure might include diversifying Taiwan's economy to see alternative markets in other Asian countries and pursue stronger security ties with the United States, and also promoting local identity in face of a more assertive China. And that would be all for my overview on Taiwan's strategy in addressing the possible the prospect for economic coercion and possible de-risking strategy with China. And thank you, Shannon, for organizing this webinar. And I look forward to the Q&A and exchange of ideas in later.
Thank you, Christina. Yes, we'll have plenty more time to discuss these topics in the Q&A. I'm looking forward to that as well. But thank you for your introductory remarks. And Kazuto, we're going to turn it over to you to talk to us about how Japan is approaching de-risking and its economic security.
Right, Shannon, thank you very much. And thank you very much for Diplomat to organize this very interesting webinar. My name is Kazuto Suzuki. I'm not only teaching at the University of Tokyo, but also I'm a director of the Institute of Geoeconomics, which is focusing on the question of the economic security. So the Japanese perception on the de-risking is, well, let me start from the sort of a conceptual part. The Japanese has focused, well, perhaps many of you already know that Japan has established the Economic Security Promotion Act, or ESPA. And this ESPA was established in 2022. This was primarily to respond to the increasing coercive actions by China for putting a pressure on not only Japan but the other countries in the world, that the economy. There's a recognition that the economy is now being tools or weaponized as to achieve the Chinese strategic goals. However, I think conceptually speaking, the Japanese concept of ESPA were primarily very defensive. So it is thinking about focusing on the intentional use of economy as a weapon. In other words, it's not taking up the risks of for example, natural disaster, pandemic, or something unintentional. So basically, this is why Japan uses the concept of the economic security, because this is about the security matter, since these are the weaponization of the economy for achieving the certain strategic goals. And this idea comes from the history of Japan in 2010, when there was a crash of the boats of the Japanese Coast Guard and the Chinese fishing boat around the Senkaku Island, which is a disputed island between Japan and China. And this crash, and the Japan Coast Guard has arrested the captain of the fishing boat, and China has stopped the export of rare earth mineral. So that was a deliberate attempt to put pressure on Japan to change its law and to release the captain of the fishing boat. And that sort of an experience has been a very significant lessons that Japan has learned, that China does not hesitate to use the economy as a weapon and to put pressure on it. So not only against Japan, but also against Australia in 2020, against Lithuania in 2022. So there are a number of cases that I can list up on how China used these economic coercive measures. So in order to meet this challenge, Japan has established the ESPA, the Economic Security Promotion Act, in 2022. And this includes the measures for improving the resilience of supply chain by reducing the dependence on China, because dependence, as Christina has mentioned, that the dependence on China is the vulnerability. So in order to reduce the vulnerability, we need to reduce the dependency. And that is basically diversifying the supply chain, improving the stockpiles, trying to invest in the R&D for developing the alternative elements or alternative material, things like that. So this ESPA has set a certain scale of the funding for the subsidies to support the companies to invest and incentivize companies to diversify its supply chain and invest in the R&D. And Japan also implements the certain investment screening processes in order to prevent the foreign, particularly the Chinese investors, to take over the nationally strategic industry, particularly those companies which are small and medium size, has very high sophisticated technology, and that therefore it is extremely important to protect those companies by investing the public funding for delisting from the stock market. So Japan has done in this year to the Japanese government-oriented funding buy out the JSR, which is the semiconductor material company. And this is to prevent that the JSR, which provides the photoresist, which that is very important material, and this sort of a protection of the certain companies has been also as being seen as a measures for the de-risking. And also, so I'll stop here. I'm looking forward for a discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kazuto. Again, there's much food for thought for our further discussion. But before we get to that, I would love to hear from you, Wonho, to talk about South Korea's perspective on these issues.
Hi, thank you for inviting me to this webinar. Today, I think I'd like to talk about two things. First, what South Koreans think about U.S. and European de-risking, and how South Korea is de-risking. First, some experts in South Korea believe that U.S. China policy is changing. They think the tone of U.S. policy toward China is softening, actually, because they think the U.S. changed the rhetoric from decoupling to de-risking. But most experts, and especially the Korean government, do not think the U.S. is changing. Actually, the U.S. Has never used a single word to describe its policy toward China. So we think de-risking is the first word, actually, the United States government actually used. So we do not think there's a major change in their policies. I think de-risking is a bigger concept than decoupling. De-risking is about risk management. So it is an effort to reduce the probability of being exposed to risk. And it can so include complete decouplings, partial decoupling, and diversification as its mean. So while both European countries and United States are pursuing de-risking, South Korea is trying to, they all try to manage the China risk, but South Korea believes that European de-risking focuses on diversification, while the United States pursues selective. And I think de-risking in Korea is similar to the de-risking in European countries, EU's approach. So our approach is mostly about diversification. So it leads to my second part. So there are two types of actually diversification: import diversification and export diversification. And import diversification is important to strengthen supply chains. So South Korea has been utilizing especially early warning system faster than any other country to prepare for this. And because we experienced in 2019, Japan's tightening their export controls on semiconductor components, and also 2021 we experienced China's export controls on urea. So because of China's export controls on urea, we had some transportation problems right after that. And also we utilize Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. And last week we had the Korea-US-Japan Summit at the Camp David, and there is much discussion on this supply chain issues. So these are all the platforms that we use to we utilize to strengthen our resilience in supply chains. And interestingly, there are some new discussions on export diversification these days, because since last year, Korea has been experiencing trade deficit with China, which has never happened before since 1992. This trade deficit with China actually surprised many Koreans. And this week I searched some data and I found out that interestingly, China, they decreased their Korean share. So Korea actually accounts for total China's trade about like these days 5 or 6%, but it used to be higher than that, like 7% or 8%. But since 2017, China actually decreased Korea's share in trade. So this might be related to their strategy, asymmetric decoupling of China. So we these days Korean talk more about export diversification. So let me stop here.
Thank you, Wonho. We certainly have a lot to discuss. I would encourage our audience members to open the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen and type questions. But I'm going to start with a few brief questions for each of our panelists to address things that you raised in your remarks. So, Christina, you mentioned the ECFA agreement as kind of an awakening for Taiwan on the issues of economic security. It's actually been floated as potentially renewing ECFA and resurrecting it by the KMT presidential candidate, Ho Yo-yi. So what do you think about the future of de-risking as Taiwan moves into another presidential administration next year? How is this going to change if the KMT or even the DPP takes over the presidential yuan?
Yes, also thank you, Shannon, for pointing out the future perspective of Taiwan presidential election. As the time approach, I think there's certainly going to be more debates on whether to renew ECFA or continue deepening economic or bilateral trade or service sectors with China. But I think the bottom line is that China continued use of economic coercion, right? Economic sanction has already raised public awareness about the possibility of, the negative impact of over-reliance on Taiwan's with China's economy. So in that sense, I think putting China's economic scale or its coercive measure in perspective really matters for Taiwan and South Korea and also for Japan. Specifically, I think the policymaker or political analysis in Asia have to really differentiate between the short-term and the long-term impacts of China's economic leverage. I think overall, our policy academia community should really avoid making an overly alarmist or dismissive view about China's economic scale or coercive strategy. For example, Taiwan's lesson has shown that China's use of economic coercion has been limited in producing the lasting political outcomes that Beijing has previously assumed. For example, in the case of Japan's rare earth material, China's export quota has raised awareness of the diversification strategy for supply chains for countries in this region, right? The 2010 incident was kind of like a silver lining, as China's sanction has pushed like-minded countries like Japan, Australia, and the US to explore other sources of critical metals, rare earth material to counter China's strategy. So I think over the last few years, China has executed a series of economic incentive and coercive measures toward China, toward Taiwan, Japan, and Australia. But these measures do not always achieve Beijing's desired outcome. So I think there is no quick remedy or a one-size-fits-all strategy in countering China coercion or de-risking with China, as the target country will have to take a long-term approach, such as structural adjustment, sectoral reform, or the WTO trade dispute mechanism to cover the economic loss from the impacted, targeted industry. But I think in the long run, the securitizations and diversification strategy adopted by these countries could be considered as the weapons of the weak in countering China's economic sanction and coercive measure.
Thank you, Christina. Kazuto, I would like to ask you about how Japan is cooperating with the US on de-risking, particularly with regard to some of the export controls put on semiconductor and related materials. Those are often framed as the result of pressure from the Biden administration. Do you think that's accurate, or is this something that's coming intrinsically from concerns that Tokyo has?
Well, first of all, I think the export strengthening the export control over semiconductor is not exactly a de-risking. I mean, it is to limit the Chinese access to the high-end chips in order to prevent China to build up its military capabilities, so that in that sense, it is de-risking or risk of China being much stronger in the military term, but it's not as de-risking as perhaps the Ursula von der Leyen said in the speech in March this year. So I think the export control over semiconductor is basically the more offensive attempt by the Biden administration to prevent to put pressure on China not to gain access to the high-end chips, so that their military capability is limited. And Japan was, yes, it was under pressure from the Biden administration, but it is also there were certain time that required to get an agreement between the government and industry in Japan to accept the U.S. offer, or let's say the U.S. request, that this is necessary in order to prevent or for the sake of the national security of Japan. So as the neighbor of China, we are concerning about the military buildup of China, and I think if the export of the semiconductor manufacturing equipment to China helps China building up the military capabilities, that is against our national security interest. So even though the companies in Japan will lose the opportunities to export their products to export their products to China and gain profits, I think these security concerns are much bigger. So at the end of the day, it was the Japanese own decisions, not forced by the United States to take certain measures, but at the same time, it was initiated by the request from United States, and finally Japan has agreed to impose that restriction.
Thank you, Kazuto. And I'll ask a question for Wonho. We actually got one in the chat that was very similar to the question I wanted to ask, so I will combine them. We have a question from Celia Sanchez, who asks, how can local politics and the attempt by politicians to appeal to different voting demographics affect South Korea's policy toward China? And I'll expand on that a bit to point out that we do have a fairly new presidential administration in South Korea. So how have economic security approaches shifted given the transition from the Moon administration to the Yoon administration?
Oh yeah, so that's a tough question. But actually, regarding economic security policies, I think we don't see much difference between the two administrations, because so all these economic security policies are focused on either supply chain issues or advanced tech issues. So in terms of supply chain resilience, I don't see much difference between the previous administration and the current one. Also, in terms of advanced tech promotion and protection, I don't see that much difference between the previous administration and the current one. but probably many people think that we see much difference in China policy. So I don't think security policies that is just equal to China policy, although there are much overlap between these two policies. And in terms of China policy, I see there's much difference between the previous administration and the current one. And because I advise the current one, the current administration, especially probably the key word is mutual respect. And unless mutual respect is fulfilled, actually, we do not think we should go further. So that's the current stance of Korean government right now against China. But we still also highly value the cooperation between the two governments. So, for example, the current administration, especially the National Security Office, tried to launch strategic dialogue with China, but there are some issues between the two countries these days, especially after the President Yeon mentioned about this Taiwan Strait issue in April with Reuters. We have a little bit bad relationship with China these days, but still we try to actually talk with China, and also I see there's some change in Chinese attitude toward Korea. In the beginning of this year, China actually didn't think that much about this trilateral dialogue, trilateral summit between Korea, Japan, and China. But I hear there are some very serious, very progressive or proactive voice from the Chinese that they want this summit in December. So there's some momentum, there's some dynamics, and also there's some difference between previous governments and this government's approach on China. But in terms of economic security policies, I don't see that much difference. Thank you.
Thank you, Yoon. We have another question from Theo Mendez, who asks, what is the interaction between de-risking and the equally new friendshoring? Are Taiwan, Japan, and South Korea always classified as friends by the US, given how they compete with the US and many of the high value added supply chains it is trying to reshape? So certainly the question of balancing cooperative de-risking efforts and the economic competition angle that is still very much present is worth considering. I don't know if one of you in particular would like to chime in on this, or if I should just call on somebody. Christina,
All right.
or Kazuto, would you like to start?
Okay. Yeah. So basically, the concept of the friendshoring is this sort of a supplementary to the concept of de-risking, or the friendshoring is one of the measures that you can take as for de-risking. So I think these two are not really different. I mean, de-risking is the concept of reducing the risks of being exposed to the vulnerabilities by depending on the certain items on the certain countries. And friendshoring is the method of diversifying the supply chain. So I think the diversifying the supply chain, I think from the Japanese point of view, the Taiwan contingency is one of the concerns that might have a certain impact on the supply chain, particularly on the semiconductor. So I think that's why the Japanese government has put heavy subsidies for inviting the factory of the TSMC to Kumamoto in Japan, so that we'll be able to secure the supply of the semiconductor, even if something happen in the Taiwan Strait. So that's partially the sort of concept of friendshoring, but in a sort of a reverse way. But also we are trying to find the friendshoring, like we are depending on the certain critical minerals from China, but now we are shifting diversifying the supply from Australia or Canada. So these are also another way of de-risking and friendshoring for the de-risking.
Thank you, Kazuto. Wonho, I think there's an interesting angle to this question when it comes to South Korea, the US, and the Inflation Reduction Act, which was in part an effort at de-risking, particularly when it comes to electric vehicles. The US is trying to reduce its reliance on Chinese supply chains, but it has potentially unintended consequences for South Korea, which I think gets to this question between friendshoring and economic competition. So maybe you can talk a little bit about the controversy and how it's affected South Korea-US cooperation on economic security.
Yeah, so last year when IRA was released, many Koreans were shocked because they thought that there's a full like cooperation between the two countries, but clearly IRA emphasized this North America final assembly. So because Hyundai and Kia, they right now are constructing their factories in the United States, but they are not ready to actually. They were not ready to produce their final products there last year. So they thought that we were kind of betrayed by the United States. But this year to 2023, I don't hear that much complaints from the private companies or the government about the IRA. I think last year I also emphasized that maybe in the short term it hurts Korean private some specific companies, but in general overall it helps actually Korean industry, especially related to solar panels or wind energy, wind like turbines. So related to renewable energies. Also, Korea is very strong at this EV battery sector. So I thought that the IRA actually helps Korean economy. So I think this year, particularly, many people actually they also think that IRA helps the Korean economy. So I don't hear that much complaints from the Korean public, but we always, if we emphasize this economic security policies, we should be also very careful about we becoming more like I say become protectionist or just try to achieve like economic benefits through this economic security policies. That kind of thing we should be careful with. So in terms of that, I think IRA's case is one of the examples that the United States actually tries to actually achieve the economic security through this IRA, like strengthening their capabilities in the United States, but they implement this North America Final Assembly section to actually strengthen or help the U.S. companies for a while. So I hope this kind of thing will never happen between these allies. Yeah. So let me stop here.
Thank you, Wonho. Christina, there's also been an interesting example of some unintended consequences from what should have been a positive story when TSMC has promised up to $40 billion in investment in a plant in Arizona to make semiconductors, which is, again, part of the Biden administration's de-risking strategy. But it stoked some political controversy in Taiwan with concerns that Taiwan is going to make itself replaceable, that other countries de-risking their supply chains is actually bad for Taiwan, because the more the world relies on Taiwan's semiconductors, the safer Taiwan will be. So can you speak a little bit to that issue and the complexity of TSMC's role in de-risking efforts?
Yes. So right now we have read the news headline that TSMC kind of moving part of this factory, maybe maybe in Japan or in Europe or in US in the long run, right? But I think to that end, it's TSMC will maintain its technology edge in Taiwan, because I think most of their most brilliant mind engineer was still based in Taiwan. They kind of wanted to develop the cutting edge or sort of I'm not really familiar with the term, like kind of like nano size chips. That's kind of like a top secret that TSMC is trying to developing right now. So I'm not really worried about the TSMC will losing its edge in the semiconductor chips. So it will still maintain the quiet edge worldwide. But I just want to come in with a different perspective on how Taiwan possible isolation in Indo-Pacific region, and how would that related to the friendshoring that we were just talking about, right? From the border perspective, the previous Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, was already formally established in 2018, including countries such as Australia, Japan, and Singapore across the Asia-Pacific region. And it was one of the most important objective for Taiwan trade policy at the time, as Taiwanese government considered that entry to TPP will integrate Taiwan's economy into the regional network, right? The goal of TPP was to formulate a multilateral trade services with higher standard for labor rights and environmental protection regulation, right? So even though the former President Trump kind of withdraw from the TPP, the Biden administration still might try to draft or join the new trade agreement, the so-called like CPTPP, comprehensive and progressive agreement for the TPP. But so as of now, Japan has taken the initiative in negotiating the CPTPP, and I think this kind of provide the opportunity will help Taiwan expand its market to other countries in the Indo-Pacific region. But at the same time, there are still challenges for Taiwan membership. For example, Taiwan's government has to resolve the trade dispute with Japan, and China at the same time also apply for the membership. So Beijing might probably invoke its one China policy to delay or hold off Taiwan's entrance application. So right now, I want to tie it back to the friendshoring we're just talking about. Recently, U.S. Secretary of Treasury Janet Yellen has proposed the idea of friendshoring to address the trade vulnerability amid the increasing geopolitical rivalry. So although Yeon has called for countries that share common value about global trade to kind of work together to counter China unfair trade practices, and although he was referring to the critical idea of diversification of supply chain for rare earth material, I think Taiwan's diversification of its own trade policy and development of cutting-edge technology could also really help the US and others to reduce economic reliance on China. And Taiwanese government and semiconductor manufacturer are well positioned to contribute to the resilience of the global supply chain for computer chips. But at the same time, Taiwan also faces its isolation, being kind of left out in the regional trade work and integration. I think that's something that we can continue to ask the U.S. and its allies to promote greater participation for Taiwan in the Indo-Pacific regional network.
Thank you, Christina. At the time of this recording, we're pretty fresh off of the Camp David Trilateral Summit between President Biden, President Yoon, and Prime Minister Kishida of Japan. And most of the media focus on that has been on hard security, plans for military exercises, intelligence sharing, things like that. But what are we seeing in trilateral efforts on economic security, particularly de-risking? And Wonho, we'll start with you because you mentioned briefly in your remarks that South Korea has actually faced some economic risk from Japan. So how is that complicating trilateral efforts for the US, Japan, South Korea to all work together on economic security issues?
Yeah, although we experienced this Japan's tightening their export controls of semiconductor chip components in 2019 against Korea because of probably the historical issue, but it's all relief. So after Yoon Suk-yeol government came to office, he tried to analyze or strengthen our relationship with Japan again. So we found a solution to the Supreme Court's judgment. So and also Japanese government, they again included Korea in their whitelist. So there's not much export control issue between the two countries anymore. And especially last week, we had this trilateral summit between Korea, Japan, United States. And we Koreans really, there's a high expectation for collaboration on especially cutting edge technologies. I think between these three countries, we have comparative advantages. For example, South Korea is good at manufacturing. US has is maybe intellectual properties or technologies. Japan is good at producing also components and equipment. So we have some, we can get some win-win situation out of this. And also, there's a high expectation, especially on this coming technologies. For example, AI, quantum, aerospace, robotics, and so forth. So in this area, probably we should work together to develop new technologies. So develop new kind of governance or the rules or standards, and also develop new market for these technologies together. So these are very important for our future competitiveness or future survival. So in this view, I think it's very important, like in terms of economic security.
Thank you. Kazuto, I'd also like to get your thoughts on US, Japan, South Korea trilateral cooperation on de-risking supply chains, economic security issues.
Right. I think this was a very a great achievement, as Wonho has mentioned, that President Yoon has turned around the very negative mood between Japan and South Korea and make it as a very positive mood. So the questions with regard to the historical issues are now being not solved, but not being as a problem between us, and the export control issues are no longer being problem. I think this trilateral summit was very productive in a way that it included the concept of the early warning system for the semiconductor supply chain. And I think this is very important because the supply chain of the semiconductor is very stretched and it is diversified. And even you try to build your own chip, you need to depend on some material from China. So we need to be sure that what sort of policies that China will take, what sort of the market situation, in order to secure the supply of the semiconductor. And also, as Wonho mentioned, I think this trilateral agreement has engaged in the issue that three countries will work together on the emerging technologies and exchange of the engineers and the scientists, particularly for the AI, material, climate change. These are the kind of things, and also standardization is a key issue. I think it is extremely important that Japan, South Korea, and the United States all together working on the same standard will give the very strong impact on the global market. So I think the de facto standardization can start from the trilateral cooperation and standardization. So I think this is a time that we can work together to set the lead in, to take the leadership in the global market for the supply chain and to reduce the dependence on China. And I think that was a message from the trilateral summit.
Thank you. So Christina, I want to kind of connect this discussion to your earlier points on Taiwan's diplomatic isolation and what that means for Taiwan's efforts. We've heard some talk about a Chip 4 alliance that would unite Taiwan with the US, Japan, and South Korea. I'm not sure if there's actually been any meetings or discussions that have taken place yet, though. And obviously, it's very difficult for Taiwan to formally participate in government-to-government talks. So what are the options for Taiwan to be brought into some of these conversations on a multilateral level?
Yes, I think, Shannon, this is really a great question. And I think that's kind of like the most important thing for Taiwan right now. Taiwan, TSMC, has assumed such a crucial position in a global supply chain or semiconductor industry. But at the same time, Taiwanese governments has not really been able to participate, in a formal or even semi-formal capacity for this chip alliance or any other kind of regional multilateral institution right now in the Pacific region. So, for example, it is really unfortunate that Taiwan was not really included in the Indo-Pacific Economic Forum, IPEF, in 2012. As Taiwan's technology company has actively supported digital trade talk to ensure greater market access in the Asia-Pacific region. And the Biden administration could really have expanded the current Blue Dot network and encouraged Taiwan that could actively participate in a high-quality infrastructure project in the Indo-Pacific region. And I think at the same time, the Taiwanese government could have worked with maybe Quad or AUKUS members in strengthening the critical communication, operation system, and cybersecurity. And in fact, I think the Tsai administration has implemented a foreign policy posture as a pivot to Indo-Pacific and expanding its soft power appeal to economic linkage in this region. Tsai administration and Taiwanese government has set up a new southbound policy and Interdepartmental Ocean Affairs Council in 2018 and the Indo-Pacific Affairs section with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So I think promoting Taiwan's substantive participation in a US-led regional networks such as Quad or the Indo-Pacific Economic Network and maintaining its resilience against Beijing threats or forceful unification or economic sanction, it's a really crucial thing, but they should not be mutually exclusive. And I think embedding Taiwan in a regional network, right, and it could really increase the stake of Beijing's, military provocations, and therefore can kind of help stabilize the bilateral relation between China and Taiwan. And so I think it will be a really important move for Taiwan or for the United States to embed Taiwan into the, a multilateral regional network in the Indo-Pacific region.
So Kazuto, I wonder if you could speak to how Japan would view this, because obviously Taiwan and engagements with Taiwan is an incredibly sensitive issue for China. I think the US gets a little bit more leeway in some senses because of its long history with Taiwan. But would Japan have hesitations about engaging with Taiwan in a formal way on economic security issues?
Well, I think it is, yes, there is a hesitation of engaging with Taiwan in a formal way, well, for the obvious reasons. But I think there are a number of attempts to make sure that we'll be able to maintain the economic strengthening the economic relationship with Taiwan. There are about 20,000 Japanese, Japanese people working in Taiwan, and there are about more than 1,000 companies, Japanese companies, operating in Taiwan, and there are so many, economic engagement with between Japan and Taiwan. So without the formal framework, I mean, the application of Taiwan to the CPTPP was an encouragement, but it also, associated with the Chinese application to the CPTPP. So we have to make a political decision or political balance. And I think, accessing the China for the CPTPP is a big deal. So we can't really make a sort of an easy decision on this. So yes, I think that from the Japanese point of view, we'll be happy to engage with Taiwan more informally. But for the formal processes, it is extremely difficult because every time that we are trying to establish something formal, then China will intervene. However, Mr. Lai, the William Lai, came to Japan for visiting the Prime Minister Abe's commemoration, and I think it was a very positive case because Japan accepted the visit of the very high-ranking official from Taiwan, and I think we took that risk of confronting with the against the Chinese complaints. So I think this is something that we can't just simply switch on and switch off. We need to build up a certain processes to to test the water of how China responds.
Thank you very much. That is all the time that we have for today. I really appreciate our three panelists joining us and giving such detailed and thoughtful responses on economic security and de-risking. I hope that our audience enjoyed it as well and learned as much as I did. And I will hope to see everyone at the next Diplomat webinar.